Okay, how is everybody? Yeah. Thank you, Kofi. We are glad you are back. Hey, if this is your first time, like Kalila said, we are so glad that you are here. We don't believe it's just another Sunday, and we don't believe that you are here by accident. So if you found your way in here, invited you, or because you found us on Google, we don't believe that you're here by accident, and we count it as an honor and a privilege that you are here. So thank you. Make sure you fill out that Connect card, turn it in at the square for a little Chick-fil-A gift card. Again, it's just our way of saying thank you. Let me ask you, how many of you, by show of hands, it's a safe place, don't worry, but how many of you have ever failed at something, you would say? I see some hands that didn't go up. I want to talk to you. I want to learn from you. Colin, thank you for your honesty, okay? You could have kept that down, but you put it. Thank you. Yes, I have failed and many times at things. One of the things that I remember failing at was in college. I took a class. It was a zoology class. And it was a mistake. So it was the only class that I ever had to drop because I was failing. But I took the zoology class because I wanted to learn about animals. Right? And I thought I was going to learn about polar bears and whales and tigers and their habitats and behaviors. Instead, we spent most of the semester learning about bacteria and parasites and learning 1,000 Latin names for these like genuses and classes and all this stuff. And so it was not what I bargained for. I was not very good at it. And about halfway through, after failing more than one test, I had to go up to the professor and say, I think I need to drop this. And he was very gracious and very kind. I was probably a lot harder on myself than he was on me. But I remember that, that stuck with me. It was, I remember the feelings as a 18 or 19-year-old, just kind of again feeling like a failure, especially when that's plastered on your grades, your F. And I felt like that. But in the grand scheme of things, the reality was it really didn't make that big of a difference. I had to, I think, take an extra class during the summer or something like that to make up for it. I think I went with geology, which was a little bit better, so studying rocks a little bit better. That was kind of cool. But I did that and moved on. And we know the reality is that failures come in all shapes and sizes. So, for me, again, in the grand scheme of things, failing that class didn't mean a whole lot. But we know that sometimes our failures do catch up to us. They do mean more, right? Maybe you've experienced joblessness. Maybe you were let go from a job because your boss told you that your performance wasn't quite meeting expectations. Or maybe you would say, well, when I think back on my failures, I think about mistakes that I made in my marriage or as a parent, or maybe you think about ways that you've let particular people down, right? Sometimes those mistakes we have, they live in our head. They live in the back of our head, and our brain likes to torment us by bringing them to the forefront of our mind from time to time. Maybe you've experienced a divorce because you said, I wasn't able to resolve this conflict, and you just feel like you wear that failure on you at all times. In our culture, we often shun failure and we highlight success. Failure is not something we like to talk about. In fact, John D. Rockefeller, once the famous oil tycoonist, he said, I have no use for men who fail. The cause of their failure is no business of mine, but I want successful men as my associates. Right? I have no use for people who fail. And so that places pressure on us where when we encounter failure, we either feel the weight of that shame or we don't, but we don't want anybody to see it. We just kind of sweep it under the rug. But thank goodness that Jesus is not like John D. Rockefeller. Instead, see this morning as we'll see that Jesus responds very differently to our failure. And the beautiful thing is that Jesus sees our failure. He knows our failure, and he addresses that in ways that we don't deserve, and often in ways that we struggle to accept. So let me show you what I mean. We're going to be continuing our series going through Mark chapter 14, the Gospel of Mark. We'll be in Mark chapter 14. So if you have your Bibles, click or turn with me to Mark chapter 14, and we're going to continue in our study. So last week, what we looked at was how Jesus went with his disciples, again, in the last week of his life and his ministry. And he sat and had this very intimate meal where we get communion from, and we looked at that and how Jesus just shared this special moment. But Jesus also shared something that was very, very unexpected, and that was that not only was he going to die, which I think that truth began to sink into the disciples' minds a little bit, but also he shared that somebody in their inner circle was going to betray them. And not only that, which that was a shock to them, but not only that, Jesus then says, not only will one of you betray me to my death, but you will all abandon me. We're going to see how his disciples respond to that. So picking back up in our story, verse 27 says this. It says, then Jesus said to them, his disciples, all of you will fall away because it is the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. Peter told him, even if everyone falls away, I will not. Now, truly, I tell you, Jesus said to him, today, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he kept insisting, if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And they all said the same thing. See, Jesus here was telling them, again, that not only is someone going to betray me, but you, much like an animal, like a sheep, he says, when I am captured, when I am beaten, when I am crucified, you all will abandon me. And we see that Peter, sort of being the ringleader for his disciples, steps up and he says, I love how he says, like he's talking about me. He's like, now I will never abandon you. These other chumps, these other schmucks, but not me. And we see this sort of like emphatic attitude that Jesus says there is no way, because when he comes face to face with his potential failure, he cannot accept it. And honestly, we've got to give Peter some slack, I think, because how would you respond if Jesus said something like that to you? Or maybe think about it like this. Imagine you, at the age you are now, imagine you were able to go back in time and you were to tell your younger self, your 13-year-old self, your 18-year-old self, your 20-year-old self, whatever. You were to go back and you were to tell them all the things that they were going to fail at. I mean, how would you respond, right, to your impending failure? Okay, listen, I see how you might have failed at that. That's not going to happen to me. But here's the thing this teaches us. We're going to learn 3 things about failure, I said. And here's the first one. And I think it's obvious, but it's worth saying. And it's just this, that failure happens to everyone. Right? Failure happens to everyone. When I asked who has failed at something, right, everyone's hand should have gone up because we've all experienced failure. It's January 26th, which means whatever New Year's resolutions you started, I imagine there's probably a few of us, myself included, that have fallen off on our resolutions, right? There are some things, maybe you made it like 4th or 5th time to the gym and never even, never further than that. Maybe you made it 7 or 8 days into your Bible reading plan, but stopped. Whatever it is, right? It happens, and we know it happens. And the beautiful thing that we sometimes, I think, either take for granted or we just don't acknowledge is that Jesus knows our failures, that Jesus knows when push comes to shove, all of his disciples then and his disciples now, that includes all of us who are followers of Jesus, he knows that we will fail him, that we will disappoint him. But the thing is, and this is what I find so beautiful, is that Jesus knew their failures. Speaking of the disciples, he knew their failures when he called them. He said, come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. And he knew their failures and he knew they would abandon them, but he called them to follow anyway. I was on Instagram. Great segue, but no, just follow me for a second. I was on Instagram last night, and I was, mindlessly scrolling through Reels, and I came across this CEO, and he was talking. He's big and famous, and he's got like millions of dollars. But he was talking about when he first owned his business, and he said, when you make your first hire for somebody, it really matters because your first hire can ruin you. And he tells a story about how he hired this man and things seemed to be going really well. The business was growing, and so he hired a salesperson. And this went for years, right? Things were going really well. Again, business was growing. They seemed to be in good relationship and with this salesperson, and they started hiring other people. Well, eventually, one of his associates, one of the CEO's associates was leaving, and they did an exit interview, and it was this woman woman, and she said, look, I've so enjoyed working for you. It's been great. You've been so kind and so good to me. And she started to tear up, and she said, but I have to tell you something. Your sales manager, your sales director, he's been taking some of the sales for the company and actually fulfilling them with his own company that he made. Basically, when he would get a sale, or when he would get two sales, one of them he would give to the company he worked for, and then the other would be the company that he started. And so essentially, he was stealing business from the company that he worked for. And the CEO, of course, was astonished at this and just realized that this man that I had trusted, this man that I had known, this man that we were, in the trenches together in business, was actually stabbing me in the back. And I think if that CEO had have known what was going to happen, he probably wouldn't have hired him in the first place, right? And he would have had every reason not to hire him. But yet we see Jesus here knowing beforehand what his disciples were going to do, that they were going to not just ruin his career, eventually his disciples ultimately, in a way, played a part in his death, in his crucifixion, but yet he called them to follow him anyway. And maybe, and I hope that that's encouraging for some of you in this room, because maybe some of you feel like you wear a scarlet letter, like you feel like, gosh, every time I mess up, I struggle with this temptation, I struggle with this sin, and every time I come to it, I feel like God must be so disappointed in me. I just want you to know that God knew your failures and your mistakes before you did, and he still called you to follow him, and he still calls you to follow him now. See, another way of speaking about failure is to speak about sin. Some of you might have heard that the ancient word for sin, the Hebrew word for sin, was an archery term, where if you pulled back an arrow or pulled back a bow and you shot an arrow, if you missed your target, technically that was sinning. So if an Israelite went out hunting and they went to shoot a deer and they shot at it and it flew over its head, technically that was a sin. Well, then they expanded the usage of the word to explain moral failures, how we often miss God's standard. Right? And that's really what sin is God says, look, here is the life that I have for you, and every time we miss that mark, we step outside of it. That's what sin is. Right? It's falling short of what God calls us to, and the Bible is clear that applies to every single one of us. Paul says in Romans, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Every single one of us miss that target. But again, much like a parent who knows that their kid won't always listen to them, God knows that we will fail to listen to him. Yet he calls us anyway. Now, that's no excuse for our sin, right? Like, we can't use that as an excuse to sin. Paul deals with that elsewhere in Romans, where he says, listen, your failure, or God knowing that you fail and knowing that God will forgive you, is not an excuse to go on sinning, but it is an encouragement to know that, yes, as we follow after him, as we seek to lay down our life and bear and carry our cross, that from time to time we will stumble. We know that God's grace is sufficient for us. To remember that Jesus understands. He knows your struggle. Maybe you're not in a season right now where you feel like you're really struggling with something specific, or maybe you are. I just want you to be encouraged that the God of the universe knows your struggles. He sees your struggles, and he doesn't cast you away because of them. Now, Peter's problem wasn't simply that he was going to fail Jesus. I think his bigger problem was that he didn't believe he was capable of it. See, it wasn't just that Peter was going to abandon Jesus like all the other disciples. I think what highlights Peter's failure is his arrogance to think, God, I'm not, everyone else is going to fall away. I'm not capable of it. If everybody else flees, I will be with you. Again, it says, verse 29, that Peter told him, even if everyone falls away, I will not. And then verse 30, truly though, Jesus says, truly I tell you, today, this very night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he kept insisting, if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And they all said the same thing. See, I think Peter was probably more concerned with who he thought would betray Jesus, because he said, it's not going to be me. I think Peter was more concerned with who was going to betray Jesus. He was less concerned about him failing Jesus. In other words, the problem for Peter was out there, it wasn't in here. And this is the second thing I think we learn about failure, and that is that failure often stems from overestimating our strengths and underestimating our weaknesses. See, sin often creeps into our lives when we think that we're safe, when we think that we don't have a problem. It's spiritual arrogance, I think, that often leads people to do things that they never knew themselves capable of. There's a famous experiment in 1971 called the Stanford Prison Experiment. Have any of you heard of that? All right, it's a pretty famous experiment. It's pretty much in every intro to psychology textbook. But this was a very famous and really morally questionable study that was done. Basically, a researcher named Dr. Zimbardo at Stanford University recruited 24 ordinary young men. So they went through an evaluation. It was very, very normal, nothing strange about it. And what he had them do was he split them up randomly into two groups. 12 of them were going to be prisoners, and 12 of them were set to be prison guards. And he wanted to study behavior and the way that the environment impacts human behavior. And so he split these young men up, and over the next 2 weeks, he watched them to see how they would behave. Now, he did say to the prison guards, he says, "You cannot physically hurt them, but I want you to create an atmosphere in which the prisoners feel powerless," right? So you want to try to make it real. And they did this. But what was surprising to him was how quickly both groups fell into their roles, specifically the prison guards. In fact, it created such a psychologically abusive environment that they had to cut the study short at day 6. Because the guards fell so much into their role that they were humiliating, again, not physically harming them, but humiliating the prisoners and creating such a stressful environment that he finally realized, wait, this can't go on any longer. And there were a number of conclusions that were drawn from this, but one of the things that the researchers noted was how under the right circumstances, human beings could do terrible things to one another. How ordinary people are capable of so much more evil than they ever imagined that they would be. And we see this in some of the ways that war crimes are often committed. People are just following orders, right? Under the right circumstances, people can do incredibly terrible things to one another, right? When we're stressed, when we're angry, when we're lonely, when we're tired, the seams of our moral character begin to show. Right, our moral compass begins to crack. And again, suddenly people find themselves embezzling money. Sometimes people find themselves lying to their family members, cheating on their spouse. And they never thought that would be something they would do. It was always something that they saw happening out there. It was never something they imagined would happen in here. And I think that's the same sort of arrogance that Peter experienced. That he said, God, even if I have to die with you, Jesus, I will never abandon you. But of course, we know 24 hours later, he would do just that. Let me ask you, do you know the depths to which you can fall? I think some of you do know that. Some of you have been there. You say, Grayson, man, I have messed up. I know just how bad things can get. Some of us don't. But the truth is we are all capable of more wickedness than we can imagine. And often, again, the greatest obstacle to our faith and to our relationship with Jesus is not something or someone out there. It's the person in here. And to not acknowledge that, I think, is spiritual pride. It's spiritual arrogance. Listen to what the Bible has to say about pride. Proverbs says, pride leads to disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. It says, pride comes before destruction, and an arrogant spirit before a fall. Better to be lowly of spirit with the humble than to divide plunder with the proud. Psalms 10 says, in his pride, the wicked man does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian author, put it this way. He said, the Christians are right. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. For pride is spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense. When Jesus, this is not the first time Jesus has talked about falling into sin. He talked about it a few chapters ago. And the word he uses in Greek is the Greek word scandalizo, which is where we get our word for scandal from. And it's a word that came to mean tripping over an obstacle, but its original meaning was referring to like a trap you would set for an animal, like a bear trap or anything else, something for wild game. And so I think it's interesting that Jesus uses that word because the way he describes sin is like a trap that we can fall into. And so often, Jesus tells the Pharisees and Jesus tells his own disciples to watch out. He says, watch out. Look out for the traps because it is a minefield. And if you think you're too good to step into any one of these traps, you're in the most danger. Because that's really what sin is. God says to Abel, Cain and Abel, as those two brothers in Genesis, if you remember the story, Cain killed his brother Abel. But before that happens, God says to Cain, listen, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you. Look it up, Genesis chapter 4. He says its desire is for you, but you must rule over it, Cain. It is a trap. But what did Cain do? Cain kills his brother because, again, I think much like Peter, he thought, nah, I'm fine. But it is a trap. And the quicker we are to recognize the trap that sin is, I believe the safer we will be. One of the things I tell myself, and you've probably heard me say this before, but I recognize that there is no sin out there in the world that I am more than 2 steps away from falling into. In other words, if sin, pick your sin, is a ledge, I recognize that I am never more than 2 steps away from falling into that sin. And one of the things that does is it keeps me from judging other people because somebody might be 1 step closer than I am. So rather than being 2 steps closer, maybe they're 1 step, but I can never feel too full of myself because I know that I'm never more than 2 steps away from falling into any type of sin, even ones that I never think that I would be capable of. And I believe the same is true for everyone in this room. Now, that's not to say that we live our life in fear, as we'll see in a second. There is hope, but it is acknowledging, it's being mindful. And I think one of the ways that we fight against spiritual pride and arrogance in our life is we recognize and acknowledge who we are, and we recognize and acknowledge our weaknesses. The Bible is filled with men and women. Often when they are walking most in step with Jesus is when they acknowledge their need and they acknowledge their weaknesses. That's when you find that they are walking most in step with Jesus. And that's why someone like Paul, who went from a murderer of Christians to one of the most influential saints, says that when I am weak, I am strong. I acknowledge and I recognize my weaknesses, but I also acknowledge and recognize God's power and ability to work through my weaknesses. So the spiritual cancer that we face is not when we know our weaknesses, it's when we don't think we have any. And honestly, the way that we fight pride, first and foremost, is really by believing the gospel, like truly believing it, truly accepting that. Because we can only accept the gospel when we're humble enough to say, God, I can't do this on my own. I can't save myself. My sins and my wickedness and my evil have separated me from you. And I cannot build a bridge to you on my own. Like that really is. I think pride is antithetical to the gospel. It is in direct opposition because it's only by laying down our pride that we can truly receive the grace and forgiveness and goodness of God. And I think Jesus even in a way implies this in his response in verse 27, going back up to the start of our story, when he says, all of you will fall away because it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. Notice that. After I have risen. See, what Jesus doesn't do is he doesn't say, so guys, just like sheep, when the shepherd is struck, you're all going to scatter, so please get out of my face, right? Don't come back. Run away and don't come back. No, what does he do? He tells them where he's going to be. So he tells them what their failure is, but he doesn't stop there. He tells them what their failure is, and he says, yeah, this is going to lead to my death, right? That's the implication. They're going to arrest me. They're going to strike the shepherd and the sheep will flee. But then he says, when I rise again, let me tell you where I'm going to be. I think what Jesus is doing is he is inviting his disciples. Listen, even when you feel like you are completely covered and swamped in your failures and your weaknesses, and you're kicking yourself because of what you did, you led to you helped contribute to the death of the Messiah. Like, I can't imagine what those disciples must have been thinking, but he's saying, listen, when I rise again, let me tell you where I'm going to be. And the reason I'm telling you where I'm going to be is because I want you to be there with me. And this is the last thing that I want you to see. And I think this is the most important thing we can learn about failure, and it's this, that the gospel is for failures. The gospel is for failures. Again, by its very nature, the gospel is good news. It is the good news of Jesus for those who know they have fallen short. It's for those who know that they've released the arrow of life and have utterly missed the mark, who see their weaknesses and yet run toward God's grace. And it is only through the gospel that our weaknesses can ever be transformed into strengths. And I think there's two ways that this happens. Like, just trying to get practical. I think there's two ways this happens. First, I think what the gospel does is the gospel of Jesus redeems our failures. In other words, it teaches us that our failures are not a stain on our life. If you've ever gotten wine or ketchup or something right on a nice white shirt or a nice white carpet, just a little parenting advice if you don't have kids, just get rid of anything white in your house. Get like speckled carpets and stuff, because man, there's going to be stain, and when it's like multicolored, you don't have to worry about it. Say that from experience. But listen, but some of us feel like our souls, our life are stained with the things we've done. And what the gospel reminds us is that there is no stain that is too great for Jesus to wash clean. And so it redeems our failures. No matter whether other people hold those sins and failures over you, Jesus doesn't. Now, it doesn't mean that we no longer face any kind of earthly consequences. Of course, someone who robs a bank can't go to a judge and say, God's forgive me, so I'm not going to go to prison. No, they're still going to accept their sentencing, but they know that at the end of the day, the God of the universe looks at them and instead of seeing their failure, sees Jesus in their place. So the gospel redeems our failures. But not only that, the second thing is that it means that God enables you to move beyond your weaknesses. So God redeems your weaknesses. The gospel redeems your weaknesses, but then helps you to move beyond them. The Bible says that God's power is made perfect in weakness. And I think what that means is it means that the power of God is on greatest display when you and I come to the end of ourselves. Again, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that God wants us to continue sinning so he can display his goodness, but I think it does mean that when we reach the end of ourselves, when we say, God, I don't know what to do. God, my relationship with my kids is in the garbage. Like, I never see my kids anymore. They don't want to see me. I want to see them. They don't want to see me. I don't know what to do. God, my marriage is failing, and I feel like every time I try to do the right thing, I do the wrong thing. God, I feel like I'm about to lose my job. God, I feel like I'm about to lose my friends. I feel like I'm running on empty. I feel like I'm on the verge of burnout. I think it's when we come to the end of ourselves, when we finally say, you know what? God, I need you. Like, I'm tired of trying to figure this stuff out on my own because clearly I'm not capable. I think it's when we acknowledge our weaknesses and when we run to the end of ourselves. And rather than just running to something else, running to something like alcohol or pornography or something that'll give us a temporary release, it's when we run to him and say, God, none of this stuff is going to help me solve my problems. But you can. It's when we do that God's power abounds, that God's grace abounds. It's when our weaknesses are staring us in the face that God gives us the grace to move beyond them. I'll just share a story, and I know each of us have our own stories, but some of you might know of someone named Chuck Colson. You might have heard his story before. Chuck Colson was a man who served on President Richard Nixon's special counsel, and he was sometimes called the hatchet man because he was politically ruthless, and he would lie, and he was loyal to President Nixon. He would do whatever it took, and he was not a good guy. Well, eventually, when the Watergate scandal broke out, and Nixon resigned, and all people were starting to get sent to prison, he was the first of a group of people that was sentenced to prison. And so he went off. He was ashamed. He was humiliated. He felt like his whole life had amounted to a pile of nothing. But it was in that moment of his lowest, it was in that lowest moment that he found Christ, that he heard the gospel while in prison and gave his life to Christ. Now, after he got out of that, he knew that God had called him to so much more, that his mistakes and basically what the rest of the country knew him as didn't define him. And so he started to think about, God, what are you calling me to do next? And he felt like the Lord was leading him to start a prison ministry, to go reach people just like him who had come to the end of themselves, who many of whom recognized their weaknesses, and many of whom were staring face to face with their failures. And so he started a ministry called Prison Fellowship, and it now to this day is the biggest prison ministry in the nation. But as Colson reflected on his life and his failures and his legacy, he said this. He said, the real legacy of my life wasn't his greatest success. He says, was my biggest failure. That I was an ex-convict. My greatest humiliation, being sent to prison, was the beginning of God's greatest use of my life. He chose the one thing in which I could not glory for his glory. He chose the one thing in my life that I couldn't be proud of, that I couldn't glory in, that I couldn't revel in. He chose that one thing to use for his ultimate glory. And I think that's an example of God helping us to move beyond our failures, God redeeming our failures and helping us to move beyond them. And what happened to Colson, the beautiful thing is that the gospel and the transforming power of Christ isn't just for people like that. It's not for high-profile individuals. It's for ordinary people like you and me. It's for people who feel like they have nothing to offer. It's for people who feel like they're a speck of stardust on this little planet we call Earth, and that our successes and our failures are going to be forgotten. It's for people like us. That God forgives, and that God helps us to move beyond those weaknesses and those things that define us. And so if that's you this morning, I just want you to know again, the gospel is for you. The gospel is for failures. If you haven't received that, if you haven't accepted that, if you haven't taken that and made that your own, I want to invite you to do that today. And all it takes, and that's all it takes to follow Jesus, is the Bible says that we acknowledge our failure, we acknowledge our sin, we believe that Jesus Christ is the one who took that punishment, who took our failures on the cross and did away with them forever, and we trust him to bring us new life. We follow him in baptism, and we give the rest of our life to him. We surrender it all. We say, God, not my will be done, but yours. In a moment, we're going to enter into a time of response, and we do some different things to respond. I mean, there's a time for prayer, and we're going to take communion in a second. But I want to invite you. Normally, the elders stand in the back. Dan, I didn't tell you this, but we're going to be down here at the front. And I'd love to be able to pray with you, and I'd love to use this as a time, because sometimes we can let these moments just sort of pass by. But as Kalila was saying, it's never just another Sunday. And so if you need to come forward and you need prayer, there's nothing special about coming to the altar, so to speak, coming up to the stage. But I think sometimes there is a mind, body, soul connection that when we come forward, when we kneel down, when we move our bodies, I think it does something in us. And so if you need to come and just pray up here alone or pray with one of us, we would love to be able to pray with you. And maybe it is accepting Christ for the first time, or maybe it's saying, you know what, I've trusted Jesus, but I've allowed the lies of the enemy to worm their way into my heart and mind. And you just need to confess that. You can do that. You just need to stand and worship or anything else. Respond as the Lord leads you this morning, but I just want to let you know that we want to provide a space for that to happen.